In this video, you will be shown the process of inpatient waiting list management. Within this video, we will show you how to add the patient to an inpatient waiting list for a non-theatre as well as a surgical procedure, how to manage the add set encounter list, and how to schedule a non-theatre or surgical procedure via the to be scheduled list. To begin this process, I am in Scheduling Appointment Book, and you will need to navigate to either the appointment inquiry, where you will need to go into the request list tab, or alternatively you can navigate directly into the request list tab via this icon. Now, once you are in the request list tab for inpatient waiting lists, the first drop down you will need is for your inquiry to be set to the add set encounter list. Now, I will begin by demonstrating a non-theatre procedure. So this will need a request list queue, but for non-theatre procedures, these will go on to the waiting list that ends in day case. So you will notice that we do have all of the specialities for this trust. And for non-theatre, you will just look for the speciality applicable to your department, but make sure it is the one that ends with day case. Now, I am using the urology day case for training purposes, and once you've dropped those two fields down, you can select your find. Now, in order to get the patient onto a waiting list, as we can see here, the first step in this process is for the clinician to place a request for the procedure. Now, for this particular patient, the clinician has already placed a request for a nephrostomography, and we can see the initials NT, which stands for non-theatre. As soon as the clinician places this request, the patient will appear on the add set encounter list, but this is just an initial request. So what we need to do now is complete the add set encounter, which will enter this patient onto a full waiting list entry. Now, the purpose of the add set encounter list is you are either adding a new encounter to this request, or you are setting an encounter against this request. Now, because this is a new procedure, this patient will likely have come to a previous outpatient appointment, so they have only been seen as an outpatient previously, and they are now needing to come in as an inpatient. So I will need to create a new encounter for this inpatient period. So to do this step, I'm going to right click onto this request, drop down to patient, and select add encounter. The first pop-up, it will confirm if this is going to be a waiting list encounter, which it should always be a waiting list encounter. So I'm going to select yes. And it will then ask me which type of encounter I'm wishing to create. So this is an inpatient procedure I'm scheduling. So it is an inpatient encounter I need to create. So I'm going to press OK to that. And it will then take me into the screen. Now, the first screen I have to fill in at this stage is the organisation. So previous videos have already gone through this process. Client name at the top you should not be completing. It is the facility name at the bottom that you will need to do. And the facility that you should be entering is the facility the patient is required to attend. So in this example, I'm going to use Bradford Royal Infirmary, but if the patient was attending Westwood Park, instead of Bradford Royal, you would be putting Westwood Park in, for example. You should never be selecting the uppercase because this is the trust as a whole, not the specific facility that the patient is attending. So I'm going to select this and press OK. Now at this stage, the system is attempting to do the patient demographics search. This will ensure anything that has changed on the spine, so i.e. the GP practice, if they've changed the patient's address, we would be able to pull this information through. I do have an error message because I am in a training environment, but we do have a separate video on how to cover that process if you do wish to watch that. Now the next screen is my select episode screen. So this is quite an important screen because the episode stands for the episode of care. So think of this particular entry here as this represents a single episode of care for a particular condition. So this could identify that this patient, this has been seen in cardiology, so this particular episode could represent an episode of syncope, for example. We could have two completely separate episodes at this stage, so I could have another entry in this top screen, so one being syncope, the other one could cover the heart failure condition that the patient has. But at this particular stage, because this patient has already been seen in outpatients previously, it's important to ensure that we are continuing the same condition that the patient has been seen for. So I am going to continue this episode of care because it is an ongoing condition. So I'm going to select this one and press OK. I'm going to make this next screen bigger. So this is where I would enter the applicable details for the encounter, but just to pick up on the pathway that I've just filled in. So the episode has pulled through at this stage. So if this is something that you need further support in, please make sure that you are contacting us on systems.training@bthft.nhs.uk, and we will go through a lot more detail on these particular episodes. Please don't guess this at any stage if you're not entirely confident. So I'm just going to start filling in this information. So the decided to admit date is the first field. The decided to admit date is usually the date that the consultant decided that this patient needed to be seen. So for example, if this patient was seen last Monday, let's say, so that would have been the 11th of October. I would be popping in 11th of October as that was the decided to admit date. So I'm just going to populate this information. Intended management. So we do have a drop down here. So we've got two options: no overnight stay required, or it's a planned admission at least one night. So this is dependent on if the patient is intending to come in as a day case or if they're intending to come in as an inpatient. So if I was to select no overnight stay, this will enter this encounter as a day case encounter. If I selected planned admission at least one night, then it will create this encounter as an inpatient encounter. I am doing this as a non-theatre procedure, so I am going to enter this as a day case, and you'll also spot that the referring clinician has come through. So this was whoever had requested this procedure to be done. Coming down, we have the lead clinician. So it is crucial that you don't follow the same process that you would do as an outpatient. So what we mean by this is a pooled consultant. We did used to use this for outpatients, but for inpatients, this will cause a data quality error in the system. So for the lead clinician, it does need to be under the correct lead clinician for who the patient will be admitted under whilst they are coming in for their procedure. If you went to the wrong clinician at this stage, this could have repercussions for the patient. For example, the results. If we have the wrong clinician entered at this point, the results will go through to the wrong clinician. So number one, do not enter pooled consultant, and number two, ensure that it is the correct lead clinician. I am going to pop this patient under Dr. Sainsbury, and it has pulled through the speciality. Priority type, I'm going to drop this down to routine, and then the next yellow mandatory field we have is an admission type code. So we've got three options for the admission type code. We have booked, planned, and waiting list. Now this is referring to the referral to treatment pathways. Waiting list, this would be used in an example where the patient is still on a referral to treatment pathway, their 18-week pathway is still ticking, and they are still awaiting for their procedure for treatment. So by us entering that this patient is on a waiting list, this means that this patient needs to be seen as soon as possible. For a planned waiting list, this is where patients are being entered onto a waiting list, but it could be a planned date in the future. So we may plan to see this patient in 3 months' time, or we could plan to see this patient in 6 months' time. So it isn't a case of they need to be seen now. which is what we have with the waiting list, we need to plan to see them later. So this is quite often used when the referral to treatment pathway has already been stopped. So the patient has already received their treatment, their pathway is no longer ticking, and we plan to see them again. So for example, if they have had a knee surgery, they have pins in their knee, and we are planning to see them in the future to remove these pins. So they have already been treated, they're no longer ticking, and we would enter them on that particular pathway. The final one is booked. This is quite often not used within the trust because the booked usually is, for example, if the patient is in clinic for outpatients, and the clinician will immediately book this patient in for a procedure date whilst they are still sat in their outpatient clinic. Quite often this is not the case. It is up to a particular team, and they book the patient in for their procedure date themselves. So that's what the booked stands for, but it is not commonly used. So for this particular example for training, I am going to use the waiting list scenario. And the final step is the intended RTT status. So following on from the explanation with this waiting list here, I will just point out that the current RTT status for this patient is a 20. So in terms of the referral to treatment pathway, this patient is still ticking, which is why I've selected waiting list. In terms of the intended RTT status, the procedure I am scheduling this patient in for may be intended for treatment. So I would enter 30 intended to be treated, but alternatively the procedure I could be scheduling right now or adding the patient on for a waiting list may be for just a diagnostic test. So this is not intended to actually treat this patient. So these are the two options you will have at this stage. Either they are being admitted just for a test and it's not a treatment, so we would enter 20, admission for diagnostics, or we are intending to treat the patient, so it would be a 30. I am going to enter 30 intended for treatment, and here in the top left of the screen I can see that I've still got some missing information, so I'm just going to find what that is. So we have the legal resident, which is a separate process. So again, if you need anything clarifying for the legally resident, please ensure that you're giving us a contact, and we will run through the process for legal resident. But in terms of the encounter information itself, I have now got everything populated, so I'm going to go ahead and press OK. This has now created this patient a waiting list entry, so they will drop off of the urology day case list, as you can see here. So the next step in this process is for me to come from my inquiry, and I've done the first step. I'm now going to come to the second step, which is to physically schedule the day case in. So I'm going to press find. My patient is now on a day case waiting list, as we can see here. So at this stage, I'm just going to simply right click on the patient and drop down to schedule. This will take me into this screen here. So this is going to ask me to repeat who the consultant surgeon is going to be. So I'm just going to enter Dr. Sainsbury just for training purposes. And inpatient preparation. So this is department specific. So make sure that you're following your own departmental processes as to what is applicable here. But I'm just going to put non-applicable for this purpose. As soon as I press OK, you'll see that it has now opened my diary. So at this point, my diary is open for today. You can use your calendar to change the dates as to whichever date the patient has been scheduled in for. It's already popped this patient as a work in progress, as well as completing the appointment tab. So you shouldn't need to do either of those particular points. In terms of your appointment location, if this needs to be changed at all, such as maybe the patient needs to come to Ward 5, if you do change that, it does not pull through automatically to work in progress. You will just need to move that across just to get the work in progress updated. I'm just going to leave that as 40 and BRI and just update that again. But once you've selected the specific date, you will then need to select whatever time the patient's coming in for. So I'm just going to enter this for 8:05 and schedule. So check that the time is still correct and that the duration is entering for the correct duration for this particular procedure, and pressing OK, it will just provisionally book that. So you can contact the patient to confirm if necessary, following your own departmental processes. Once that has been confirmed, you can then come to the confirm button. TCI location, so this is for Ward 14. And do you wish to print a letter? So I'm going to say no, because I am just doing this video for training, but in live you would obviously press yes to this. Now, there is actually a further mandatory field within this screen, but if you do accidentally forget, when you press OK, it will prompt you to populate this information. So what it's actually asking is for the TCI date. TCI stands for to come in. So this is the date that the patient is intended to actually arrive for their procedure. Now, I am doing a day case for this patient, so the TCI date would just be the 20th of October, which is the date that I scheduled the patient in for. But if I was doing an inpatient procedure, let's say, let's take an elderly patient, for example. An elderly patient may not be able to get ready for 7:30 in the morning, however early that patient needs to actually be in hospital for. So the TCI date may not be the same date as the actual procedure date. It may be the day beforehand. It's important that we actually get this correct within the system, as we won't be able to admit the patient on the day of their procedure, or in this case, it may be the date that the patient actually comes in. So I'll repeat this step for the inpatient procedure when I get to it, but for the day case, the patient will be arriving the same day. I'm going to press OK, and that is my day case procedure all scheduled. Now, the second part of this process is an inpatient procedure, so I'm going to come back into my waiting list. You will still need the ad set for theatre procedures, but this time I'm just going to drop my request list queues, and you will have a BTHFT theatres list, which is here. Pressing find, and this is the list of patients. Now you can see the difference with these procedures, as instead of saying NT, they say S, which stands for surgical. So these are our inpatient procedures. The theatres list will pull up all specialities, so you do have filters for surgeon speciality, but please note some of these filters do not work correctly. So if you do use any of these filters at any point, you are at risk of actually filtering out patients that you need to schedule. So just to be aware of the issues surrounding these filters. For this reason, I am just going to keep this basic with just these two drop downs selected. Now, the first part of this process still begins with the clinician. So the clinician will have been the one that needed to order the procedure. The second step of this process will be the same as previously, where you would need to add your encounter. So I'm going to repeat all of the same steps that we've previously been through. So it's still an inpatient encounter. The patient is intending to come in to Bradford Royal Infirmary. I'm going to continue the same episode of care. Now, for the decided to admit day, I'm just going to put in today's date, but repeating what I said earlier, this is the date that the clinician saw the patient and decided to admit the patient. Intended management, this time it's actually going to be a planned admission because we're doing an inpatient. Same as previously, make sure your lead clinician is correct and it is not pooled. Priority type, I will do routine, and we can see here this patient is on a ticking clock, so I'm going to drop my admission type code to waiting list. And this is a treatment, so I'm going to pop this down to 30. Okay, so I've got all of my fields filled in for my encounter, so I'm going to press OK. So all of those steps are identical for your non-theatre procedure as it is for your surgical. The only difference is your intended management. So now I've done my first step, I'm going to go to the second step, press find again, and you can see my patient here. So Final step is to right click, go down to schedule, and it will take us straight into the diary. Again, we've got this pop-up inpatient preparations. I'm just going to put non-applicable, but again, follow your own departmental processes, and it will then complete the appointment tab, as well as pop this as work in progress. Same as previously, if you need to change your appointment location, make sure you press move to update this on the work in progress. Now, in terms of theatres, this is quite often captured in real time using a separate application called Galaxy. So you'll notice we don't have time slots within the diary at this point. And this is because it's captured in real time in a separate system. So this is just capturing the activity in EPR. So again, making sure your date is correct. I am just going to pop this in and press schedule. You can change whatever theatre room you are using just by, if I wanted to do modular theatres 1, I would highlight that particular section and schedule, and it will pull that through, as you can see from the resource here. And then you would just need to change the time. So I'm just going to say 7:30 for this one. Has popped this in as an hour, so I'm just going to change that to 30 minutes instead. It has given me a warning, so just to make sure that you're reading these and not just overriding them immediately. So the procedure should have been scheduled back in May. So this might have been for capacity problems. So I am going to override this, but again, make sure you're following your own departmental processes in terms of escalations. But this has now provisionally booked this slot, so I'm going to go ahead and press confirm. So again, if you miss any fields, you will get a pop-up just to remind you. And as I was going through a few minutes ago, your TCI date should be the date this patient is intended to arrive for their procedure. So following the same example I used earlier, if this is an elderly patient, for example, they will not be able to arrive for 7:30 in the morning. As a final step to this process, you will also need to ensure you are dropping down your patient letter. So the options we have here is BTHFT P2, P3 or P4. For the purposes of this video, I am going to go with P2, and then as soon as you've got everything else filled in, you will be able to proceed and press OK. So the date I would actually be putting in here would be the 19th of October rather than the 20th, and this will ensure that we are able to actually admit this patient. So I'll press OK to that, and that is that patient now scheduled in for their surgical procedure. So this is the processes on non-theatre procedures as well as surgical procedures. If at the end of this process you are wanting to ensure that the system has generated the appropriate P1, P2 or P3 letter, this can be done within PM Office. When you are in PM Office, you will need your published post documents band on the left hand side, and in my case I do already have the required work item, which is the patient correspondence, but in some circumstances you may not have this created, so you can create a new work item by simply right clicking and going to work items. When you hover over work items, you will need to add a work item, and the work item type you'll be needing is post document. Once you have the post document type open, from the navigation bar is when we can start filtering for what we want within the patient correspondence. So at the moment there is nothing selected, as we can see if I just navigate through the different options that I have here. We've got nothing selected, so I will just need to work my way down and select what it is that I'm requiring. So I want to search by patient, so I'm going to add that for the search. Document type, we are needing the P2, the P3 and P4, so I'm just going to add those three in, but then you will also need to select what you require from the demographic columns as well as the document columns. Now, because I do already have this created, I'm just going to cancel out of this, and I'm just going to edit this particular work item so you can actually see how this is already built. So I'm just going to edit the work item. So for the search, as you can see, we already have the patient search. I do have a lot more selected options in here. So my P1, P3, sorry, P2, P3 and P4 options are just down at the bottom of the selected list. If you've already got this generated and you don't actually require all of these options, you can actually just start selecting and removing them if they're not actually required. But for the demographic columns, we've got the MRN and the full name. And for the document columns, we have the post-document ID, document layout, document type code, treatment function, the create date, time, and the print date. So I'm going to leave that as it is. And again, I don't want to change anything within that, but this means that as soon as I click onto the patient correspondence, it will come up with the patient search. So I will simply type in the MRN number for the patient I wish to search. And as soon as I press search, it will then load up with a list of documents as to whether or not it generated a letter. So in this patient's case, we can see that a P2 letter was generated on the 15th of April at 2:44.